What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood. Now, this is a game that actually saw its initial release in early 2021, however it was an Epic exclusive, and only recently came to Steam, which is why I'm reviewing it now. That said, currently you can buy this title on Steam normally for about $30. For its launch, they put up a small sale and you could actually get it for like 23 bucks, I think it was. Now, the big reason I actually wanted to review this game was because when it came out, I heard that it was not great, frankly. And I kind of wanted to see for myself what that was about, as I am a fan of World of Darkness games and just in general that tabletop franchise. I think it's really cool. So I kind of wanted to see what all the negativity around this game was. And to put it succinctly, I think some of it is warranted, I think some of it isn't. And to kind of just sum that up at the start of the video here, best I can tell, it appears that this game was $50 on its initial launch. I find a few different conflicting numbers, it's kind of hard to verify that this far out when I wasn't really verifying it back then. But it looks like it was about 50 bucks from what I can tell, which is nonsense. This is like a 10-hour game. And for $50, there's no way I would recommend this. And to be honest with you, even for $30, that's really pushing it. This is a game that is in its best price range, around $15 to $20. Now, normally I have a bit of a format when I cover these games, and this is such a short game that I'm going to just kind of talk about this game broadly and not really use a dedicated format that I would normally use. But from there, let's actually jump into the review itself. Werewolf the Apocalypse is one of the sections, if you will, of the World of Darkness, which also includes games like Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Ascension, etc. And in Werewolf the Apocalypse, obviously the big focus is on the werewolves and their interaction with what they call the wild, the weaver, and the worm. The wild is just basically nature. The weaver is the world's attempt to make order from chaos, and the worm is destruction. At some point, the worm became corrupted from its purpose of destroying to make way for new life to just purely destroying. And the werewolves serve as a sort of stopgap from the worm just doing whatever it wants, and a lot of the stories therein kind of revolve around protecting nature, etc. Now, this game is no different. We largely see ourselves up against a corporation known as Indran, that is secretly controlled by the worm and is using its money and resources to pollute and damage the earth, which is of course a great offense to the werewolves. And the story kind of picks up from there, and it has a very personal touch as well with the main protagonist, Kahal, the character you'll be playing through the journey as. Now, I'll say this on the story before we move on. The story itself is okay. There's nothing to really write home about. I don't think it's going to win any awards, but it's a decent story. The real problem with the storytelling in this game is honestly just the character animations and how stiff and expressionless everything is, because werewolves largely center around a rage mechanic, which we'll get into a bit more later. But basically, werewolves operate off of rage, and every conversation you have is like two brick walls talking to each other, like there's no expression of any kind, really. Combine that with the fact that the animations of these conversations themselves just look like they were done 10 years ago for a game that came out in 2021. And it's really bad. It's probably the worst part of the game, hands down. But from there, as you play through the game, it is, for the most part, a fairly linear experience. You will be operating out of a sort of hub area that you'll go on a few missions for. There's actually going to be 2 separate hub areas throughout the game that you'll return to, and you can do side quests in the hub area before you then go on another mission, which is more of an instance ordeal. Now, from a world building perspective, I think they did a pretty good job with the werewolf stuff. Because if you like werewolves and you think they're cool, the werewolf and the combat part of the game is pretty awesome. There's a lot of notes and things that you can find, like what company Indran has actually been up to, how they've been doing all these incredibly unethical experiments, and how to destroy and manipulate people, and just awful things that they're doing behind the scenes that, of course, have a fantastical element to them. It also covers a lot of ground with how werewolves operate, how they interact with the spirit realm, how they get their strength from spirits. And in that regard, in world building, the game itself does a very good job as a primer for what Werewolf the Apocalypse is kind of all about and how it plays. And that's the kind of thing that even bleeds into the character progression a little bit. So in order to progress your character, you earn what are called spirit points, which are basically level ups. And while you do, of course, sometimes get these from combat encounters, etc., you can also use a sort of alternate vision, they call it Penumbra Vision, which will let you see spirits, usually in the form of like plants and things in the regular world, that you can absorb, which will then give you more points towards your level up. And in this way, you can actually just about max out all the skills in the game, actually, if you're diligent and actually vacuum them all up. But from there, let's talk a bit about combat and how the rest of the game plays. So the combat itself and the game itself is largely kind of a stealth mixed with action adventure game. Most of what you're going to be doing is infiltrating these in-drawn sites, typically via stealth, though you do have the option to go full-blown werewolf at almost any moment, but we'll get to that. But basically the way this works is that you'll stealth into an area, typically a large room with enemies. There are going to be reinforcement points that if you go into rage mode, other enemies can come through. You can sabotage those to weaken enemies should you choose to fight later. You can also stealthily take down enemies in a variety of ways, either physical or with a crossbow bolt. However, if you alert enemies, they will start looking for you. If they find a body, they will start looking for you. And if they find you, the room actually locks down. And at this point, you're kind of forced to go full werewolf, which is known as Krenos, which is when the sort of action beat-em-up brawler part of the game begins. When you're a werewolf, you actually have a few different options. You have two stances, agile and heavy. Obviously, these are used best against different types of enemies, and you have skills that will upgrade each of these stances to make them more effective. Moreover, if you are engaged in combat long enough, you'll have the option to go frenzy, which is both of the stances combined basically, but also has its own separate tree of upgrades in the abilities as well. So you combine these things, and in most cases, you will have options for how to deal with a lot of situations, either stealth or going full-blown werewolf. However, once you play the game for a little while, you start to understand that this is more constrained than it initially seems. Because as I mentioned, all of this takes place in an individual room, meaning that combat encounters are actually set encounters in some ways. Some are actually unavoidable. Sometimes you can actually stealth kill everything in a room, which effectively ends the encounter, the same as if you had snuck past altogether. But basically, this also makes the doors, the entrance and exits to that combat arena, a bit of a brick wall to NPCs, meaning that you can't attack them from outside of the combat arena, and they can't even detect you from inside of it. So if you open a door and stand literally inside the door directly in front of an enemy who can see you, if you have not stepped foot into the actual combat arena, it will not register with the NPC at all. And in that way, the AI, if you want to call it that, is very weak. And what initially comes across as kind of a fun stealth action adventure kind of falls apart, in my opinion, once you realize that fact. But that said, the combat itself was a lot of fun because, there's just something about being a werewolf tearing through things that's a lot of fun. The combat itself does get a bit repetitive even in the short runtime of the game, which again, a full playthrough doing absolutely everything is going to run you about 10 hours. You could probably cut it down to like 6 or 7 if you're blasting through it pretty quick and not doing everything. Late game, they try to mix it up with some more fantastical enemies and enemy types, but there's only so much I felt like they could do with this particular type of combat, and it's okay for about the runtime of the game. To kind of wrap this up and talk positives and negatives a little bit, on the positive side, it's a really fun werewolf adventure. Like, let's be honest, werewolves as a piece of fantasy are a bit underserved, honestly. Like, in terms of quality werewolf stuff, there's just not a lot of it. And truth is, as mediocre as honestly I would say this game is, it is nonetheless a pretty good werewolf game, just because the bar for werewolf games is very low. The other positive is that this is a fun game to play in a short burst. You could honestly knock this out in a day or two, and the combat is fun and engaging enough that I don't think it's a bad time. Overall, it's decent. Combine that with the more fantastical elements of what Werewolf the Apocalypse is, and I think they did a decent job there. But on the negative side, you unfortunately have some pretty big ones. For starters, the conversations and the animations in those conversations are just bad. I mean, we're talking, they look like a decade old bad. And then you combine that with the sort of smoke and mirrors of the approach to combat, which are basically just combat arenas that you're entering into, which kind of ruins the immersion and some of the emergent gameplay that could have gone into it if they had just kind of connected everything a little better. Because instead of sneaking around from place to place, what you're really doing is sneaking from combat arena to combat arena. And in some cases, combat is unavoidable, so you actually have even less choice than you might even realize. So my conclusion for this game, frankly, is that while it would be a decent game for, I would say, about 15 to 20 bucks, so maybe think about picking it up on sale. It's kind of a fun one and done in a day sort of game. It's certainly not a game that I would want to pay $30 for, frankly, which is what they're charging full price for on Steam. And moreover, when this game launched, it was again $50, which is nonsense for a 10-hour game, especially one with this of like low quality animations, etc. There was never a world in which they should have been charging $50 for this game. That's insane. You bring that all the way down to like $15 or $20, and I think you got a decent price range for what is, again, largely speaking, a mediocre game that is honestly a bit above average if you happen to like werewolves. But there you go, guys. My review after 100% for Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.